Bienvenidas, bienvenides. Thank you for joining us for our discussion on anti-migrant militarization and pro-migrant movements along the northern and southern Mexican borders. This event, which commemorates tomorrow's International Migrants Day, is a joint effort between the Latinx Student Association, the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, and the GSAS Student Center. As a lot of us know, xenophobia is not limited to the United States. Mexico too has engaged in inhumane policies, particularly towards migrants from Central America, Africa, and Haiti. As such, we're proud to bring in Mendez Ramirez and Paulina and Krys, two scholars from the University of California, San Diego, who will share their research and activism on this very topic. We're gonna give each speaker a chance to go for about 20 minutes before transitioning to a general discussion. During their presentations, we kindly ask that you stay muted, and if you have any questions, please save them for the end when we will convene as a whole group. Now, we'll go ahead and get started with Mendez Ramirez. Krys is a Honduran American researcher and organizer. For the past 15 years, he has worked with various immigrant rights and grassroots organizations in New York, California, and Chiapas. He is currently a doctoral candidate in the Department of Ethnic Studies at UC San Diego. He researches the politics of race, geography, and security in Central America. So yeah, by all means, Krys, if you're ready, go ahead and you can get started on the dialogue.
Well, thank you for inviting me to present on this topic, especially at this really critical moment. So just to give people a sense of what my research has been, I became interested in this topic about 6 years ago, in 2014, when at the time there was all this sort of attention around the crossing of unaccompanied migrant children, right, at the U.S.-Mexico border. And it turned, that summer there was a sort of, if people recall, there was this quick succession of events that happened. The Obama-Biden administration, for instance, launched this initiative called the U.S. Strategy for Engagement in Central America. The idea was to sort of provide something like $1 billion aid package to the Northern Triangle to stem the flow. But at the same time, in Mexico, there was this increased crackdown because of pressure from the US. And it turns out that that particular year I was visiting family in Honduras. I was in San Pedro Sula, which is the industrial capital of the country. But that year was also, called by the international media the murder capital of the world because of its high homicide rate. And so being there on the ground, I had made several trips to Honduras in the past. Having grown up between there and New York in the 90s and seeing like all these developments since 9/11, following the crises that happened after the 2009 coup. And, just to give people a sense of the kind of insecurity and terror that people are living with, I was staying with my cousin that summer. And I had an aunt who was essentially on her deathbed. She was just a couple of blocks away. And as it was getting dark, my cousin insisted on taking a cab just to get there, which, was, I've never, even in Chiapas, I just didn't encounter that level of fear. And this, my cousin's from there, so she knows, right? And I also asked her about visiting my grandmother's tombstone, and I had been able to do that right after 9/11, because she died actually like in 2001, and the fact that she was, my cousin was like, well, we can't do that because the cemetery is under the control of narcos, and that already just that putting that in the context of everything else that I've learned about the situation in Honduras for the last like 20 years or so, I think that's sort of like what spurred my interest in this topic on border security. And, in the last 6 years, I've been, following those questions. Living in San Diego, Tijuana for 6 years, and having been to Tapachula, having studied some of the politics in the Northern Triangle, all of it has given me a sense of the workings of border security. So, I mean, I do have a PowerPoint presentation. I might not necessarily sort of stick to it strictly, but it's sort of, you can see it as sort of like a way for me to guide my conversation. So, okay.
Looks good.
So one, if there's anything that I would want to highlight, given my focus on the Northern Triangle, there is this sort of way in which we imagine the region as this zone of violence, poverty, and weak institutions. That's constantly the rhetoric that I've come across looking at all this news media and reports from politicians and reporters. But on one level, we either sort of essentialize these aspects to the region. So by that I mean, like, well, Honduras is just sort of a violent place. It's just people there. There's this sort of this generalized culture of poverty or illegality. We've seen that kind of rhetoric from like the Trump administration. But on the other end, we also have, let's say, the rhetoric that we get from President-elect Biden, right? Supposedly, there's, you could look at his platform and see all these references to quote unquote root causes. And sure, I mean, you do have this sort of, we can trace a lot of the, much of the reason behind the exodus to gang or drug-based violence, but we don't really ask, well, why is there that kind of violence, right? Or where is, what's the, what are the legacies here of neocolonialism? What's the role of imperialism? What is, how are all these sort of private development initiatives involved? His platform includes a lot of kind of like neoliberal policies, with regards to, international banks and things like that. The very things that actually dispossess people. So I personally, don't see this, I don't see that as being the solution, but I think it's also kind of interesting to see, like, well, where, like, how is this rhetoric kind of like concealing or disguising or obfuscating what is actually going on? So that's sort of like my general kind of way of approaching this. But just directing my attention to Mexico's southern border, I spent a considerable amount of time. I spent 3 summers in Chiapas. I was in Tapachula, and was that? So sorry, I think there was a bit of a distraction there. And in that time, I was able to cross the border. I visited cities within Chiapas. I was able to travel along the coast, along all the sort of, well, actually, just to backtrack a second. So Tapachula, as some of you might have like known, it's typically like the first big transit hub or the first big stop that people would encounter on their way north. And it used to be the first stop of La Bestia, right? Up until 2005. Now migrants have to travel another 200 miles to Arriaga, which is, part of just the general gauntlet that Mexico has sort of created for them. Tapachula also has the largest detention facility in Latin America. And you also see, one of the things that stood out to me was the fact that, you see more Central American, there's a large Central American population, more so than I've seen in other Mexican cities. And you also have, all these migrant flows from places like West Africa and Southwest Asia. I mean, that's increasingly becoming more of a trend. So what I have, like, as far as like the next couple of slides are just sort of like general observations that I've noticed, and also things that are part of the understanding of what's going on with Mexico's border. And then I'm eventually going to talk about the role of the US in all this. So Mexico's border strategy. One way we could sort of characterize like the difference. So, because of the fact that there are, rivers and all this sort of rugged terrain, it's not really conducive to building up big border walls. And, the border is generally porous. I mean, I was able to cross back and forth between Mexico and Guatemala, without sort of presenting any official documents. So it's permeable in that sense, but at the very borderline itself. But Mexico's sort of border control strategy is more about having all these security forces along in the interior, along all these transit routes, the train lines, putting up all these roadblocks and checkpoints. In fact, when I was the times that I traveled up the coast of Chiapas, I counted something like 9 or 10 different roadblocks, which all had a very different character to them. I guess it was hard to tell who, which of the security forces they were a part of. Is this the Mexican Federal Police? Is this, what exactly was being done here? And well, I'll get back to where the surveillance and the security equipment. But these are some of the some quick shots that I was able to take in the region. And one of the as you can imagine, one of the consequences of all this is it's just made the trip riskier and just amplified this vulnerability for migrants. Now, because of all the security, the sort of crackdowns, you have more people sort of taking irregular routes. They're either going through rugged terrain, say like through the jungle, or they're a lot of migrants have attempted and even lost their lives trying to go through trying to take ocean routes. So like I said, Tapachula has the largest detention facility in Chiapas, El siglo XXI, the 21st century detention center, which also goes to show you this is how they perceive, modernization, and a lot of it, a lot of what we're seeing as far as now shifting to the role of the U.S. in this, a lot of it comes from security funding through the U.S., right? And so, for instance, when the U.S. government was putting pressure on Mexico, part of it came from a sort of how could I put this? There was already set a bilateral agreement called the Merida Initiative, which was signed with the Bush administration back in 2008. And one of its central pillars is modernization of the border. And so a lot of this funding, and we're talking about billions of dollars, have been funneled that way. And you have now, Mexico uses the kind of equipment that you see in the north, drones and helicopters, and there's all this surveillance, training of security forces, things of that nature. Though, that kind of security agreement also extends to all these other, so the other parts of the hemisphere. So this is actually a map that I took out of a State Department document. So you could see, well, the US is sort of trying to find ways of expanding or stretching out, or pushing out lines of defense. The idea is securitizing all of these regions so that you could sort of establish, you could control migrant flows, but also it's about like securing capital, right? And so, I mean, the way it's spoken of in a lot of the security discourse or the security documents, it's, what we're doing here is pretty much externalizing or pushing out the border. And, we have so many different examples of, how this has been happening just in the last couple of years. I mean, things like the migrant protection protocols. I mean, again, that's a euphemism that even Mexico and Guatemala, in fact, use, this idea of protecting migrants, when in reality, it's all about controlling mobility, controlling the ability to cross borders. So it's really, so you see, people being sort of pushed out to places like Tijuana to sort of wait out their asylum cases. You have these safe, another sort of euphemism, these safe third-party agreements. This idea that some migrants could sort of wait out their asylum cases in places like Guatemala, which is where people are fleeing in the first place. And now with the pandemic, I actually looked at some of the language of this, but the pandemic has been sort of been used as an excuse to sort of deny all types of asylum cases and really expel migrants more quickly. So this is like through what happens to be Title 42 of the Public Health Service Act. One last example of how the border has been pushed is also the fact that, and this is something that has gone under the radar, but the US has been pushing this sort of strategy of building US military bases all over the Northern Triangle. So for instance, you have in Tecunumán, which is right across the Mexican border in Guatemala, you have this large, what is called an interagency task force base. And there are bases littered all across the borders between the three countries of the Northern Triangle. Not to mention, the rest of Latin America. So that is essentially the gist of where where my work has gone as far as border security. I'm definitely sort of interested in questions people might have, or like where, I think as far as what could be done now, I mean, now that we're sort of at a point where we're facing like a transition in presidential administrations, I think we really need to sort of hold Biden's feet to the fire. I mean, he has a track record. Of working on issues affecting the region. you know, I mean, even his policy platform, you know, says, well, we're going to try to look at root causes. So, you know, how can we sort of ensure that we're not going to replicate a lot of the issues that happened through the Obama years? I mean, if we actually do succeed in rolling back a lot of Trump's really heinous programs, well, are we just going back to the kind of things that we had with the Obama administration? So, I mean, that's where I'm at now. But you know, I wanted to sort of give people, you know, a bit of a reading list. You know, I'm knee deep in academic like PhD land, so you know, I divided it according to like books on border militarization for folks who watch it. One really good resource, if folks are looking for all types of books and films and things like that, would be Teaching Central America. And then for folks who are, you know, interested in really like reading stories directly from Central Americans, which I think is really important. There's a bit of a list there. I mean, there's only, you know, I feel like I can't do justice to all the different stories that are out there. I felt as somebody with like relative privilege, like being in academia, trying to sort of really get at the root of US imperialism was kind of, you know, an imperative for me. So I think, yeah, that's about it for me.
Great, thank you so much for sharing that with us, Krys. Appreciate it. Definitely very enlightening, and also like I saw that you mentioned Luis Eli's "Tell Me How It Ends." I read that for a class not too long ago, and it was such a beautiful book, but also so intense. But I definitely want to echo that's a great piece, and I'll definitely check out the others. So thank you. At this point, we'll go ahead and highlight Paulina, who is going to share a couple of things with us. Oh, before I begin, okay. So Paulina. Paulina Olvera Cañas is a Mexican graduate student pursuing a master's in Latin American Studies at UC San Diego, where she researches migrant educational opportunities in the She's also the founder and director of Espacio Migrante, a collective in Tijuana that promotes inclusion, cultural dialogue, and access to human rights. Her continued advocacy has led to the organization founding a shelter and cultural and community center. And I just know Paulina personally as a good friend of mine, so I'm really glad to have her here with us, and I'm excited to hear what she has to say. So thank you, Paulina.
Thank you very much, Michael, for the opportunity. I'm really excited to be here in this space. So I'll talk about the situation that we're living in Tijuana right now with migration, that of course has gotten worse since the pandemic. But I want to go back to 2016 because that's when the Haitian migration arrived to Tijuana. And I think that was a point that really changed the way that we work with migration from civil society. So in 2016, in Tijuana, around 20,000 Haitians arrived in order to seek asylum in the US. And this is the first time in Tijuana that we had full families migrating in such a large scale, and also the first time that we had extracontinental migration from the Caribbean and also from African countries. So that presented challenges, but also there was an open border policy for Haitians in the Mexico-Guatemala border, which meant that the Mexican government issued them an oficio de salida, which is a document that allowed them to arrive to the northern border. The problem is that with such a large amount of people, the US government started implementing metering policies. So this is the first time that the US government implemented an informal process that in Tijuana we call it La Lista. And it's basically a list, but it's an informal list, basically written in handwritten on a notebook, sorry. And the problem is also that no authorities claim responsibility for this list. So both the US authorities and the Mexican governments deny the existence of this list, or they say that asylum seekers manage this list. But what does this mean? This means that before 2016, asylum seekers could show up at a port of entry and seek asylum and be led into the US to carry out their process. And now what has happened since the Haitian migration, but also with the other policies that I will touch about, is that the cities in northern Mexico, we have become like a large waiting room where migrants are stuck for months or even years. And that means that cities like Tijuana, that are also not safe, they're some of the most violent cities, like Tijuana, Ciudad Juárez, Matamoros, now they are becoming a forced destination for migrants. And so we had the Haitian migration in 2016. It also presented a big challenge for civil society. Even though Tijuana is a city of migrants, we have infrastructure in regards to shelters that have been doing this work for about 30 years. We had about 8 shelters in Tijuana, but it wasn't enough for the crisis that was presented at the border. So we saw that from May 2016 until December 2016, we had from 8 shelters to 38 shelters in just a few months. And these were mostly Christian churches and small community groups, mostly from Christian religions, that opened up their churches or their spaces, but didn't really have the infrastructure or the resources to run a shelter. And we also saw the abandonment from the Mexican government to deal with this crisis. In the end of the Obama administration, actually, there was a change in TPS for Haitians arriving after September 2016, which meant that they weren't eligible to apply for TPS. So this meant that Haitians that were arriving after this date to the US, they were in danger of being deported back to Haiti. So this is when thousands of Haitians had to make a decision. And it's estimated that about 5,000 Haitians remained in Baja California between Tijuana and Mexicali. I'm really not sure about this amount because there's really no information available about Haitian population. Actually, this year was the census in Mexico, and it's the first time that Afro-Mexican and Afro-descendant populations are counted. So we're also waiting to see more information about the Haitian and African populations in our region. I think another event that impacted the way that we work at the border was in 2018 with the arrival of the caravans, mostly from Central America. And back then we had just started our first space, because when we started our work, we were supporting the different shelters in Tijuana. And so in 2018, we actually had our own place, and we had a community center near the San Isidro port of entry. And that's when we had the arrival again of a large caravan with thousands of families and a lot of women with small children. So that created a second humanitarian crisis. And we also saw the beginning of policies like the zero tolerance policy that was announced here in San Diego. And that meant that families were separated at the border. So we saw a big crisis there. But I think many of the populations that arrived during the time of the caravans, some people are still waiting in Tijuana right now, because in the next year after that, in 2019, when we opened our shelter, the US and Mexico started implementing policies that are basically dismantling the asylum, the access to the asylum process for asylum seekers. So what are these policies? The first was the implementation of the metering list, but now as a policy that was taken to other points of the border. So now we have the metering list in Tijuana, but we also have it in Ciudad Juárez and in different border cities. And like I mentioned, it's an informal process, so each city runs it differently. For example, in Ciudad Juárez, Mexican authorities helped to run this list for asylum seekers. But in Tijuana, if you go to Grupo Beta and INAMI, which is the Mexican Migration Institute, they will tell you that asylum seekers run that list. And it's true, asylum seekers are in charge of writing names down in the list, but in the end, it's the Mexican Migration Institute that holds this list and that is responsible to collaborating with the US in the metering process. And what are some of the problems that this list causes? First, that it's an informal list, so it causes a lot of corruption. We have heard testimonies from migrants that say that numbers on the list are sold. Back in 2016, they mentioned 3,000 pesos, $300. And last year we were hearing that people were paying $1,500 to have their name go up faster on the list. So that of course creates corruption. It also creates problems for populations such as unaccompanied minors, because they have no way to put their names on that list. So if an unaccompanied minor shows up at a port of entry, they won't be allowed to be put on the list, and the Mexican government will contact DIF, which is sort of like child welfare services for Mexico. And they really have no vision or strategy to work with refugee children or underage unaccompanied minors. Their logic is to treat them as a Mexican minor and to send them back to their home country. So basically deport them. So we saw this as a big concern. We know that there's organizations with US attorneys that are working in Tijuana, such as Al Otro Lado, which is an organization that we collaborate with. And basically, we had unaccompanied minors in our shelter that were referred from Al Otro Lado. And basically, the only way that an unaccompanied minor can show up at a port of entry is with a US attorney. And even then, they get turned down several times. So it's become really hard for them to even access the right to be in a waiting list, right? Also in 2019, after the caravans arrived, after the caravans arrived, the first caravan in 2018 arrived around April. The second caravan arrived around November of 2018. And this is the first time that the Mexican government opened up a state shelter in Tijuana for a few months, but the conditions were inhumane. The first camp, it was more than a shelter, it was like a camp that they opened. The first camp was in a baseball field in the open air, and this was in November, December in Tijuana, when the weather is very cold. Families were exposed to getting sick, and there were heavy rains in those times. So people were exposed to getting sick, and it was just really a humanitarian crisis, like I mentioned. Then we had a change of administration in Mexico, and the federal government took over and they opened up a second camp in El Barretal. But we saw the same thing, like bad conditions and a lack of transparency and access to local and binational organizations that wanted to go in and provide legal services, orientation, and getting in touch with migrants. So we saw a very difficult situation, and this is when we made the decision to open up our own shelter. It's a project that we had been planning for since we started the organization in 2012, but luckily the caravan also brought attention from international agencies. But what we always say is that international attention is always there when there's a crisis. And for example, when Haitian migration arrived, there was a lot of international organizations, UNHCR, etc. But after the crisis was over, they left. So this time we made sure to voice our concerns and say, we need local organizations to be strengthened so that we can continue working, because these crises are going to continue to happen. So luckily right now there's actually an office from UNHCR, an office from International Organization for Migration. So we see more permanent presence from international organizations. But back in 2018, it was just as a response to the crisis. So we opened up our shelter in February of 2019. And some of the first challenges that we faced was the waiting list, because families had to wait in our shelter about 2 to 3 months until it was their turn to seek asylum. But then around May 2019, we started receiving the first families in the MPP program, which is the Migrant Protection Protocol. So this means that after families have been waiting for months on the metering list, they seek asylum in the US and they get sent back to wait for the process in Mexico, either in Tijuana, Mexicali, at the different border cities, and show up at their hearings every couple of months. But of course, this creates a lot of problems, because migrants that are in MPP, first, they have to figure out by themselves how they are going to resolve housing and basic necessities. There's shelters, of course, like in Tijuana. There's less shelters in other cities like Ciudad Juárez, Matamoros. They're not cities that have usually had a big infrastructure of shelters like Tijuana. But even in Tijuana, it has been a struggle, because migration keeps arriving to Tijuana. Like I mentioned, our cities have become a big waiting room, or even how do you say, like bottleneck. So people are stuck here waiting for a long time. And also people are still getting deported and being sent to Tijuana as a port of entry. So it just created a big problem for shelters. But also if people are waiting in Mexico for their process, this means that they don't have access to legal representation. We know that it's even hard for migrants that are physically in the US to find representation. But for migrants that are in MPP, we feel that they have been made invisible and they're out of the radar, even for many organizations that are based on the US side, because they're not physically in the US. And so, for example, I was able to accompany a couple of families on their MPP hearings, and just the things that the judge would ask them really showed you that the lack of knowledge about the reality in Tijuana, because migrants are expected to have a stable address where they can receive correspondence by mail about their hearings. But first of all, they might stay at a shelter for a couple of weeks or a month, and they might be moving around shelters, or they might find housing for a couple of months and might have to move because of their economic situation. Secondly, the mail in Mexico is completely unreliable. There's no way that you can get urgent communications by mail. And this is something that it's a big problem in practice for these asylum seekers. And of course, when they go to these hearings, they are given a list of pro bono attorneys and organizations. But when they try to call, most organizations can't come to Mexico and to represent clients, can't communicate with them, and really won't take cases. There's a few organizations like Al Otro Lado, Jewish Family Services, that are taking cases, but it's just not enough for the thousands of people that are in the MPP program. And I think another one of the impacts of this policy is the mental health strains that it causes on families, because they went from waiting 3 or 4 months to waiting a year or more for their cases, and there's just a lot of uncertainty. And this year with the pandemic, things have gotten worse. Since March 21st of this year, the border was partially closed for non-essential travel, and the US government didn't consider asylum to be an essential matter. So this means that we even had families in our shelter that had been waiting for a year, that were about to have their final hearing in March or April, and now they have been another year waiting with no information. I think that's another point too, that there's no strategy either from the US or the Mexican governments to inform these populations about all these changes. Even for us as organizations, it's hard to keep up about all the changes in the law that are happening every day. We need to be very in touch with our partners on the San Diego side or on the California side, but it's hard to get information, and it's even harder for asylum seekers. For example, during the pandemic, the border was closed, but there was no information as to what was going to happen to their cases. If they were supposed to show up at a port of entry on the date of their hearing and then get a new date. But at the same time, many shelters implemented stay-at-home policies, so they didn't let them out. So it just became a lot more difficult for people during the pandemic. And I also want to mention about the policies and practices from the Mexican government, because we have seen a clear collaboration from the Mexican administration with these policies. For example, one of these was the change in policy for migrants arriving at the southern border. So like I mentioned, for Haitians, they were given a document called Oficio de Salida, which allowed them to arrive to the Mexico-US border. And Mexico also created a humanitarian visa program to give them the opportunity to get documents in Mexico. That wasn't the same case for the caravans from Central America. And even now, with Haitians and Africans arriving at the Tapachula border, they're not getting this oficio de salida. So what is happening? They are being placed in detention. What Krys was telling us about in the Tapachula detention center, which I think it's actually the largest in Latin America. But there's human rights violations that have been denounced. How do you say, hacinamiento? Like many people in a small space with inhumane conditions. And there's been a lot of human rights violations that have been denounced by partners in Tapachula, such as Centro de Derechos Humanos Fray Matías de Córdoba and other organizations that are on the ground. I think one thing that has really helped us has been to have communication between the Mexico-Guatemala border, the organizations there, and the ones here in Tijuana and California, because these policies are policies that start in Tapachula impact Tijuana, and policies decided in Washington, D.C. impact also the work that we do at the border. So, and I think another policy that really impacted these populations was the deployment of the National Guard in 2019. So like Krys mentioned, in the southern Mexican border, even though there's no wall at the border, there's different checkpoints where you can see INAMI and then later the National Guard too doing operativos or raids. But we hadn't really seen that in Tijuana, because the logic, I guess, was that if asylum seekers are already that far, they're going to the US. So Mexico did a job to stop migrants in the southern border. But now we saw the deployment of the National Guard in Tijuana. We saw it performing operativos in downtown Tijuana near our shelter, which is a space where there's a lot of migrant shelters and a lot of migrant population because it's close to the border, and just doing operativos and asking migrants for documents. And migrants have been impacted by this, but particularly Black migrants have been impacted because the National Guard and INAMI use racial profiling to stop Black migrants. Even when they have documents, they get harassed and stopped by Guardia Nacional, by INAMI. Now, before they used to get stopped, we have a detention center here in Tijuana as well, run by INAMI. But after a couple of days, they could get out and be given a oficio de salida. Now with the change of policy, since summer of last year, we started receiving testimonies and people that said that migrants were being stopped in Tijuana and being sent back to Siglo XXI or to different detention centers in the south of Mexico and being deported. So this was really concerning as well. And we know that it's also a response from the Mexican government to the pressures that they receive from Washington, D.C., and they're collaborating in this way. And another problem that has impacted the migrant community in general is the municipal police of Tijuana. They usually harass migrants, but also they use racial profiling to target Black migrants in particular. In the beginning of this year, in January, there was a death of a Haitian man in the custody of the municipal police in Tijuana, and the man was in a plaza, and when he was detained, he suffered an asthma attack. So, of course, when the George Floyd death happened, we saw a lot of connections with what had happened in Tijuana. And we see that the same racist policies and narratives that happen in the US are happening also in Tijuana. And that's why the last part of what I was going to mention is that even with the border closed and with the pandemic, and I think I'll get to share a bit more about the pandemic in the Q&A, but I think one thing that I can rescue from this time is that it has allowed us to build connections and alliances with organizations in San Diego, in California, also in Tapachula and Guatemala, but also connections with other movements like the Black Lives Matter movement in San Diego and in Mexico. And we actually, I don't know if I have time to share a few pictures. We actually helped to organize the first Black Lives Matter protest in Tijuana. This was organized. This was organized with migrants from Haiti, Cameroon, Ghana, also Afro-Mexican leaders that helped to launch this, because anti-Blackness and racism isn't something new in Mexico, of course, but in Tijuana, we see it very connected with the migrants, with the migrant issues. So this poster, for example, says, "Asma, no puedo respirar, I can't breathe." So it really, it was even chilling to find those connections between what is happening in the US and what we see here in Mexico. So these were some of the protests that we did back in June of this year. And I want to mention that this phrase, resiste gozando, I want to mention briefly. So one way that we fight against racism and against these narratives is through our cultural events and programs. And at first we did it only to start the conversation about racism, about the realities of migrants, but we have also found it to be something healing for these communities, to build community and to have spaces where we can also enjoy music from Haitian community, from Central American community, and we have kind of taken it as our motto, resiste gozando, resist joyfully. And that's something that I personally like about the movement that is being formed in Tijuana. And another meaningful thing to mention is the Defend Asylum movement that is being built along the Mexico-US border. So we received a phone call from a partner organization, the Kino Border Initiative, based in Sonora and Arizona. And they planned a couple of protests, binational protests, back in August and September. And they invited us to join in Tijuana and San Diego. So we held a protest in Tijuana and San Diego, and we had a big response from asylum seekers. And it was important to work with them, but to follow their lead and the message that they wanted to project about what is happening. And so just to end, I think from asylum seekers that are waiting right now in Tijuana, they are hopeful about the change of administration. We are not overly hopeful. We know that we're gonna have to continue fighting for this, but we see it as an opportunity to continue saying they are still here, right? The migrant caravan hasn't left. There's people from the caravan from 2018 that are still in Tijuana. And what we want to do with these actions, protests, and cultural events is to make this visible and to not allow it to get erased. No? So that would be all for my part for now, and I'd be happy to continue this conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that information with us, Paulina. And also, sorry if I froze. And also, I wanted to say that Paulina recently published an article in the San Diego Union Tribune about Black Lives Matter and the movement in Tijuana. And I'm posting the link to that article in the chat. And I'll make sure to include it in the follow-up email as well. But yeah, at this point, we can go on to have questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or feel free to put it in the chat, and then I'll make sure to highlight it. And we also have a set of questions as well that we're happy to ask as well. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to like grab my attention and I'll be sure to highlight you. In the meantime, one thing I was wondering, and I'm sure a lot of us feel the same way, is because ooh, did I freeze? Sorry. Because so much focus in the media around migration often focuses on Mexico and Mexican migration specifically to the US in a way that almost like absolves the state, or like takes away from the way that the state has perpetuated harm towards other communities. Building off of like kind of that idea though, like my question is kind of just, what are some of the sentiments you've seen within the general public in either Tapachula or Tijuana or regions that either of you have observed in relation to migrants from other countries? And is there like an awareness of the way that Mexico has perpetuated harm either towards Central Americans, Haitians, Africans, or other communities that are becoming more visible in these areas?
So just to clarify, your question is with regard to the Mexican state, or?
Yeah, like, is there awareness among the public within Mexico about the role that the Mexican state is playing? And then what are the general sentiments that you've seen within the public, either in Tapachula or Tijuana? And I apologize if that's like a little bit of a pivot from what we discussed earlier.
Well, I mean, one thing that does stand out, you know, and I mean, I think it's really interesting that, you know, one thing that I kept hearing from people in Chiapas, for instance, was, you know, generally people like hardly consider what happens right south of the border, right? For instance, like, you know, even though there's this proximity, but in the same way that people in the US hardly ever know what's going on in Mexico, like people in Chiapas or people in Mexico in general just don't have any idea what's going on with like, say, the Guatemalan government, or the sort of like government sort of like institutional like issues, any of those kind of developments, just like, it's just not in the public consciousness, right? I mean, there is a lot of treating Central American migrants as like an invasion, something, because one thing to consider is the fact that Chiapas particularly like is one of the poorest states of Mexico. And so like there is this kind of like dynamic of like, well, we're all sort of like competing for all these informal jobs that are available in the economy, and I think that definitely sort of breeds a lot of resentment. So like I've definitely have heard much on that front. I mean, I'm sure Paulina could say more about Tijuana, but from what I recall, I mean, even the mayor of Tijuana, sort of made a reference to migrants as kind of what was it, this sort of like infestation of the city, So, I mean, that says quite a lot.
Yeah, I agree with Krys. I think that generally in Mexican population, this is not an issue that is very present, but maybe in border cities like Tapachula and Tijuana, we see it more. But I think most of Tijuana's population, of course, they realized when there was a big crisis, right? With the Haitian crisis. For example, when Haitians arrived, what I saw was a big show of solidarity towards Haitian migration. We actually we formed a committee called the Committee of Humanitarian Aid in Tijuana. It was a call done through social media, and hundreds of people arrived to want to help. But this doesn't mean that there was voices against it. For example, many business owners in Centro, where migrants were camping on the streets, they complained because they said that they were invading the city, that they were harming their business. And we also saw back in 2016, a racist group, they denominated themselves, they call themselves Mexico Primero, like Mexico first, like a nationalist group. But we only saw it in social media. We didn't really take it seriously until a couple of years later, when one of our Haitian friends had a book presentation. He wrote a book about the journey of Haitians from Brazil to Tijuana. And at the book presentation, we had people from this group show up and verbally assault them. So this was actually like impact for us. But I think when the caravans arrived, we saw something completely different. We saw an openly racist narrative that came from the media, from the Mexican national media, even before the caravans arrived to Tijuana. Since they were entering through the Tapachula border, it was already all over the media that it was an invasion, that these troublemakers are coming and they are MS-13, and the same narrative that we saw from the media in the US and the Trump administration, we saw the same thing here. And then our previous mayor in Tijuana, he was also outspoken against the caravan. So he said the people from the caravan, they're criminals. He even said a phrase that los derechos humanos son para los humanos derechos. Like human rights are only for good humans, something like that. So it was really terrible. I think even Trump congratulated him on Twitter. But what we have seen, we have also seen a big comparison of people saying, oh, Central Americans are troublemakers or criminals, but Haitians, they are good, they are hardworking, there are people that come here to work. So we saw these two groups of migrants being put against each other. But it's funny because many of the people that were saying these speeches didn't feel like that when Haitians arrived. As an example, I remember an elected official that openly spoke against Haitians when they were coming. And then when the caravan arrived, she was saying, oh, why are they not like the Haitians? Why are they not hardworking? But we really saw, we were actually impacted by these racist narratives because when we had the community center in 2018 in Casa del Túnel, we actually got evicted. We lost our place when the caravan arrived. The neighbors complained and the landlord basically said, if you continue to work with Haitians, it's okay, but we don't want these troublemakers. So we really saw a big, or we still see a big racist sentiment and narrative against Central Americans, but this doesn't mean that Haitians and Black migrants aren't, of course, experiencing racism. For my dissertation, I'm interviewing Haitian and African migrants, and some of the things they share is, for example, the difficulty to find housing because nobody will rent to them, or the difficulty to find a job even when they do have documents. So I don't really believe in this narrative that the good and the bad immigrants, because I think that all of them have been impacted by racist policies and narratives in Mexico.
There's actually like something that I forgot to mention and that I think is actually really important. Just thinking about, this treatment of people in the caravan. So for instance, there was actually another caravan that had been started from San Pedro Sula in early October. And already in Guatemala, they were turned back. The new president actually kind of used a lot of the same discourse, talking about like the way that, U.S. empire sort of like keeps pushing the border and sort of, enforcing all these security measures like further and further south. I mean, they were, in Guatemala, they were using this sort of hateful rhetoric against Hondureños, which is like really, I mean, it's really fascinating because, historically, the countries in the Northern Triangle were always interlinked. In fact, it used to be the case, well, technically it's still the case, if you have a Central American passport, if you're part of there's like 4 countries that are part of this kind of this like regional accord where you can easily cross borders, right? So that would include the Northern Triangle and Nicaragua. And now, and especially with the pandemic, we're having all these sort of like hardened borders where you can't even cross into neighboring countries, you know? And so, I mean, I think I'm sort of pursuing and following like what exactly is going to happen, you know? There's definitely more militarized borders all over the hemisphere. And so I think, you know, to say that we have like this border empire is pretty accurate.
I have a question about education. So I think this is probably a little bit more directed at Paulina, given the work that you do, but Krys, if you have thoughts, I'd love to hear them as well. And I'm conferring, I'll say, with my friend and colleague, Maxi, in the chat. So we're interested in how Central American children and young people are accessing schools in this space, because it sounds like they're not able to enter Mexican schools. The US is not really providing any educational support, and it sounds like shelters have had to actually step in. And so I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about the right to education and how that has been dealt with. Thanks. And thanks so much for both of your talks.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Maxi. Maxi and I are actually working on a research project about this issue, but it's very important because actually Tijuana is one of the cities that has actually a program, a state program, part of the Secretary of Education called Pro-Migrant, which is a program that was started for children of deported parents or US-born children that were sent back to Mexico with their families. And this program, what it does is that it helps to ensure that children can access education. However, actually in 2016, when Haitians arrived, we had many families, and we were part of the efforts to support some of these families to enroll their children in school. I think a new challenge is that in part of this program isn't considered multilingual education or education for children that don't speak Spanish. However, many of the Haitian families that arrived back in 2016, they finally seeked asylum in the US, and we saw more single adults that stayed behind. So we didn't really consider too much about basic education until a lot of the Haitian youth started being interested in attending university. And there we saw other challenges because this program that I mentioned, Pro-Migrant, only covers basic education. And in Mexican education law, education is supposed to be a universal right. But the problem was in reality, when Haitian youth went to present their documents, the first step for them is to validate their documents so they can have validity in Mexico. So they need to get their documents translated. And however, when they reach out to the local office of education, they would get turned down because of a lack of knowledge from education authorities about these processes with foreign population from Haiti. So we saw big obstacles for a lot of Haitian youth to access university. Then when we opened our shelter in 2019, last year, we saw an interest from some of the parents to start going to school and really working with Pro-Migrant. We didn't have a problem to enroll them. However, I think one of the biggest problems is that families in Tijuana don't know about this program. It's a very small office in Secretaría de Educación, in the Secretary of Education, and most families have no way of learning about it. And most families, what they do, well, first of all, many of these families actually didn't consider their children going to school because they considered that they were in transit in Tijuana. Their goal is still to seek asylum in the US. And also the reality is that many of them don't feel safe in Tijuana. And I can say that the same goes for families in Matamoros and Ciudad Juarez that we have been speaking with, they didn't even feel safe to leave the shelter or the camp in some instances to take their children to school. So they didn't want to take that risk, but also education wasn't their priority because they were still trying to figure out how to get on the metering list and find a shelter. However, now that the border has been closed for almost a year and that families have been waiting more than a year for their process, there's a growing interest in families. And I think also because the school year just started, so there's a growing interest, and we're making an effort to share this information that education is a right. But unfortunately, when families go directly to a school, they find sometimes misinformation, they get turned down. Sometimes the principals will straight up say, no, because we only accept Mexican students. So we also see that they're facing discrimination to access education. And it's a topic that we're still researching about. I'm lucky to be part of an awesome team of women researchers that are that were working on this issue in Tijuana, Ciudad Juarez, and Monterrey. And I think for the Tijuana side, at least, one of the big focuses will be to share this information and accompany families in their process of enrolling their children in school.
Thank you, Paulina. And I think maybe just to like wrap things up, Krys, you started talking about this already, which was pretty enlightening. It's just like COVID and how that's reinforced a lot of these borders. Can each of you kind of just talk about the way the pandemic has either exacerbated certain issues or brought new issues to light, or just in general the impact that COVID-19 has had regarding these communities?
Well, I mean, I think it's clear that the pandemic has certainly been used as an excuse to harden borders pretty much globally. I mean, this is definitely not sort of restricted to Mexico or Central America, but it definitely stands out with Central America because, again, there's this it's called the Central America 4 Visa Agreement between the Northern Triangle and Nicaragua, and usually there's sort of like, free mobility between those countries if you're a citizen of one of them. And I think what happened with the caravan that left from San Pedro Sula to Guatemala just in October, being turned back. I mean, I think that's definitely like, a sort of almost unprecedented like level of militarization and pushing back. That said, though, I mean, I think it's also it's important to remember that Central America was also slammed by 2 hurricanes, like back to back. It was Eta and Iota, and we're actually starting from what I've read. I mean, we're initially at the beginning of the year with the pandemic, we saw sort of not as many migrants were trying to cross the border. Now we're starting to see the numbers rise again, and part of that a lot of people believe is due to the hurricanes, and those hurricanes particularly hit sort of like poor indigenous regions of Honduras and Nicaragua, and so I mean, it's I guess we'll sort of wait and see if this is going to sort of like create like another surge. But I think one thing that I'm also thinking about with respect to all of this is, there could be a shift in policy as far as the US is concerned. There could be a shift in policy just in a matter of months, depending on, whether Biden is proactive or not, so so there's a lot of things that are kind of like up in the air right now, policy wise.
Yeah, I think that the pandemic came to like increase the the hardship that asylum seekers were experiencing in border cities. I think first in March, when the pandemic started, the first concern for shelters was, how are we going to keep the families safe? Because most shelters in Tijuana, for example, like us, don't have a place where they can quarantine people, or they don't have enough resources to react if somebody gets sick. So we were really concerned about that. And there was really no strategy from the Mexican government as to what measures shelters should be taking to avoid what people thought would happen, which is everybody said there's gonna be a crisis with the pandemic in shelters. But luckily, after all these months, there hasn't been an outbreak of COVID in any of the shelters in Tijuana. I know that in other cities it has been a problem, but I think shelters in Tijuana took quick steps to prevent this from happening. We started working with closed doors, which means that nobody can go in or out, and we stopped receiving new families. But this was also a problem because migration didn't stop. We still had families arriving to Tijuana, and they found the border was closed. There was no waiting list where they could write their name, and there were also no shelters opened. Since June of this year, the IOM opened up a filter hotel, which is a hotel where families or individuals quarantine for 2 weeks, and then they can be sent to a shelter. So this has helped us to continue to receive people, but it has just been hard because at this point, families have been locked up since March, so 9 months without going out at all, and also with the uncertainty about their cases. So I think, again, one of the big impacts has been mental health for these families, because the waiting causes great uncertainty. Actually, in September, some of the families found out that their hearing was being pushed until January of next year. First, they had been told September, and then it got pushed to January, and that created a new crisis among many of the families. But I think another important thing to mention is that most of the asylum seekers that are in Tijuana are not in shelters at this point. So there's migrant communities that have been in Tijuana since 2016. For example, the Haitian community, some of the African communities, and they were already renting their own place, working in Tijuana. There were also people that were in the MPP program, still waiting to seek asylum or on the metering list, but they had already been able to find an informal job and leave their shelter when the pandemic hit. And of course, they lost their job, and they have been heavily impacted in many ways, but especially economically. We actually have a program of communities, and we started having conversations with some of these migrants that are not in shelters. And the goal was to provide them with food aid. So we gave them a gift card so they could buy food at the supermarket. But we did a questionnaire with them to find out about the impacts of the pandemic. And what they share with us is that they lost their job. Many of them don't have money to pay for housing and even to bring food to the table for their families. And these families include people with small children or elderly people as well as Black communities. And I think one thing to mention also about Black communities is the language barrier, because even though the Haitian community has been in Tijuana since 2016, there's no translation services in any of the institutions. Like if they go to the general hospital, they'll get turned down and they won't get information or they won't understand it. So some of the things they mentioned was housing, food, also access to healthcare, because they continuously get turned down at the hospital. And there's also a lot of pregnant women that are not receiving attention. And another thing that they mentioned is that many of them don't have documents. So I think it would be important for Mexico to open a program like they did in 2016-17 with Haitians, because especially right now, people cannot be without documents and not be able to access jobs and healthcare in the middle of a pandemic. And I also want to mention that Mexico has a responsibility with the MPP population, because they agreed to receive this population in Mexico under the premise of humanitarian aid. and they have done nothing. We have seen an abandonment from both governments towards asylum seekers at the border right now.
Thank you. And Gustavo, welcome back. Did you have a question? I know you were inching earlier.
Yeah, sorry, kind of lost connection there for a bit. I'm not sure if it was much of a question, more of a observation and comment to the harsh realities that immigrants in Mexico are facing, and I do see that parallel that immigrants here in the U.S. have faced over the past 20 years. I see Mexico as both Paulina and Krys mentioned, repeating and mimicking what the U.S. has done in the past, except that maybe they are 10, 20 years behind in services, which kind of, produces feelings of sadness and infuriates part of me as well, because we are repeating that trend. However, I think that having this hindsight and this foresight could enable us to learn from what the U.S. has done and what steps, after many years of fighting, such as opportunity to study for youth. I think here in the U.S., what was it, like in the 80s or the 90s when that whole issue of whether immigrant children should be allowed to pursue even elementary education. And so I think that learning from those experiences is something that the Central American government should implement. But then again, we do have the issue of corruption, and that's kind of a huge cultural issue that impacts all aspects of immigration, how they go about it. So I just want to say thank you to both of you for coming in and speaking with all of us, and your perspectives and information have definitely filled us with emotions and information and ideas, and hopefully some form of call to action as well.
Great. Well, thank you for your comment, and thank you for the questions, folks. And thank you especially to Paulina and Krys for sharing. Appreciate both of you. Thank you. It was a very enlightening discussion, very crucial, vital discussion, especially today. I think I froze again. Hopefully we'll continue getting to know you better over the years and reading more of your research as it comes out. But thank you so much. Thank you for attending to the rest of you, and we'll have more events coming up next semester. But in the meantime, have a great holiday break, and we'll see each other again soon.